Thank you for having me here. My name is Артём Морозов, and Oleg asked me to make a presentation on Skolkovo Innovation Center. As you might know if you watch TV, it's a huge initiative to bring together science, engineering with infrastructure, resources, market, to produce an innovatively active ecosystem. It has a special economic regime and service environment. I'll speak about it in more detail right now. One of the most important reasons for creating Skolkovo is the life cycle of technology and the gap that exists in Russia. If you take a look here, research is disconnected from the market in Russia. We don't have efficient mechanisms for funding research and translating it into applications. It results in very weak commercialization and not very active innovation in Russian companies. But we have also a few more gaps. The practices of sponsored research are underdeveloped. The culture of entrepreneurship in Russia is rather weak, and we'll perhaps address that later. The institutional environment is not the most conducive to innovation. R&D infrastructure is underdeveloped, and it produces the effects which you can't discount when you look at the innovation system. It's low productivity and brain drain. It means that people can't find application for their talent, can't realize themselves in Russian R&D in Russian universities or research centers. I will give you an eagle-eye view of Skolkovo, and then we'll better transit to discussion. So it is the city of 400 hectares, around 30,000 people working there, 6,000 professional jobs. It is being designed by exceptionally professional architects, a number of laureates of Pritzker's Prize. That's correct. It's like Nobel Prize, but in architecture. It will be a pedestrian-oriented city with all the best practices of European cities, and hopefully consistently designed, and it won't be evolutionary, with a sustainable design and all kinds of certifications. It will be opened in 2014. It will have a special economic regime, no VAT, for instance, social tax at a lower rate, refund of customs duties, and own customs service, which is very important because Russian bureaucracy doesn't help conducting research at all. Simplified migration law. Skolkovo is focused on 5 thematic areas, which is energy efficiency, IT, biomed, nuclear, and space. It means that just research, development, commercialization, something appearing in those areas. It consists of several key elements, which is university, which we now create in partnership with MIT, startups sitting in the business incubator, corporate R&D centers which efficiently provide the market and market feedback for something done in Skolkovo, venture capital funds, and we could expand that Skolkovo I mentioned right now to a greater system by including Moscow School of Management, New Economic School, and possibly others when we reconceptualize. All those elements add qualities to the ecosystem, and without those qualities, without those resources, the ecosystem will not be complete and will not function. A few words about Technopark. It provides all kinds of services necessary to bring not so probably active people. We don't have such a vibrant environment here in Russia as we have in Silicon Valley, so we have to provide a more favorable environment in terms of services, access to funding, and so on. So the Technopark will focus on several services like coaching and training, providing infrastructure and funding, market assistance, actually legal services, and so forth. we have a number of corporate partners. You can see by this list, by this picture, something I said earlier is rather right, that this project has enormous political traction. On the boards of Skolkovo Foundation sit CEOs of Google, Nokia, whatnot. It's a number of other huge companies. I forgot that. Cisco. Okay. Now I'll speak briefly about the Skolkovo Institute, the project we were doing for 1.5 years so far. And then I will talk about Skolkovo environment and culture, which connects us to something we discussed today. Skolkovo Institute will be a graduate university with 1,200 students, which will hopefully fully integrate innovation and entrepreneurship into its research and education program. By doing that, it will transition something that is an entrepreneurial university in common current understanding of the word. Recently we have signed a 3-year contract with MIT. The institute will help us to establish the university. Skolkovo will provide all kinds of support, will provide internships for our faculty, students, will help us recruit people. The university will have 5 programs aligned with 5 thematic areas, and one of the more interesting features of it will be research centers, which from the very start will be multi-university. The key requirements will be to have an international partner in the proposal and a Russian partner. So from the very start we try to integrate a gene of collaboration into university research. Its innovation and entrepreneurial agenda will be boosted by Center for Entrepreneurship, which I omitted from this slide for some reason, but now I remembered about it. And the university will be in a unique position in Skolkovo. It will be a source of expertise at an unprecedented, perhaps, level in Russia, technological expertise, because we can see by other examples that new universities can recruit world-class faculty. And by 2018, if we reach the level of 200 faculty, it's enough people to provide significant expertise in the 5 thematic areas. Oleg asked me to reflect on our negotiations with MIT, which lasted for more than a year. Several groups of people were involved. It's MIT faculty, it's Russian academics, primarily representatives of Russian Academy of Sciences. It's management of the foundation and legal officers, and also government. All those groups had some gaps between themselves in understanding the subjects they were discussing. Here is a list of 7 such subjects. For instance, role of faculty in the United States was misunderstood from the very start. They thought that MIT president or provost can order a faculty to do something. Then distribution of how faculty members spend their time. Also, they thought that people just sit in the labs and do not go anywhere, do not pitch, do not sell, do not attract external funding. Next point is that we do not need a model for the university. We can create it from scratch without having an institutional partner. Then that the contract with that institutional partner should be a services contract, not a collaboration, and that we need to put an emphasis on quantity, on measurable deliverables instead of quality, instead of collaboration, and put bureaucratic control everywhere so it can hold them accountable. And it is linked to the 5th point that it wasn't understood that we have a very significant gap between capacity of MIT to deliver and our capacity to take something they deliver, to develop our local capacity, which will allow us to assimilate that. Then we have some political logic behind, as in every, perhaps, such project. Masdar couldn't avoid that also. And the seventh point was perhaps mentioned today. It's interdisciplinarity and lack of understanding of complex collaborations. I tried to understand why did that happen. Perhaps it's cultural bias. For instance, we can say that seventh point is about trust. If we increase level of trust, it's easier to form that complex collaborations. Political logic is about distance to power, is about our perception that we can force any relation, anyone under us to work. The fifth point is about pride, and so on. You can continue. So I'd like to address you a question: how do we deal with it in Skolkovo if we have that limitations? By the way, I didn't mention that we expect half of the residents of Skolkovo to be foreign, so it will be a mixed population. It's still unclear if we are talking about creating an ecosystem which is productive, and productive means that it executes productive behaviors. Do those cultural parameters allow for such behaviors to take place in Skolkovo? And finally, I wanted to say a few words about engineering approach to design in Skolkovo. If we talk about an ecosystem, ecosystem is something that is not designed, and it doesn't have a purpose or an objective. And that's how it's different from an engineering system, which is social and it has its purpose. I believe we have such a case in Skolkovo with a very significant social component, policy pillar, and so on. If we look at other innovation ecosystems, we can see that authors distinguish a number of success factors which are pretty simple, like favorable economic regime, accessible resources, accessible talent. But it obviously cannot explain why some systems fail, some systems work. We need to look for intangibles there. We need to look for more factors which contribute to systems being productive. We can see that in Skolkovo we have all that elements or objects contributing to qualities of the system. It is architecture and buildings which produce experience. It's infrastructure, it's institutions, it's institute, and it's governance. But those are just frameworks, and everything happens in the interstices of those frameworks or boundaries in between. And we need somehow to grasp that, what is that environment, culture of the place, which produces that experience, which motivates people to act that way or another. So I will just list a few terms which allow us to focus on those or other processes and objects in Skolkovo. It's experience and attractiveness, it's communities, its behaviors, their types and efficiency and effectiveness. Depending on accessibility of resources, for instance, we can have both variety of types of behaviors and both their different costs. It produces qualities of the ecosystem, for instance, like creativity, openness, trust, something like that. And a few more words, which are, by the way, getting a lot of resonance lately. I'm observing how people think about entrepreneurship, especially the most advanced practitioners and those practitioners who reflect on something they do. And they mention explicitly mindset, values, culture, and so forth. And we need to understand how do those get assembled in a system and produce a mechanism which puts somehow that system in an equilibrium, whether that equilibrium is dynamic or the system becomes sustainable. And I'll welcome your feedback and reflection on that.
Thank you, Артёm. Some questions? I know it's late in the day, but when serious topics are raised, I see serious questions. Okay, sorry.
I'm worried about, there's a question about the architecture. What stage is the building now built at this institute, or is it still a design stage?
It's still in design stage.
Yeah, so is there a possibility of STS feedback into the architecture? Is that a realistic possibility?
Yes.
Because there's a rather good literature, I think, on scientific buildings and collaboration. There's a very good article by Tom Segura on this. And I was reminded again, reading the biography of Steve Jobs, that for him, in building Apple's new campus, the most crucial one decision he made was the design of the building. I was talking about Oleg about this before, to make certain that there weren't these hierarchies, so that all the different divisions of Apple would meet in a common space in the middle. That's just a really compelling example of how design of a building really does influence an innovative culture, I think.
Absolutely. I didn't find this format appropriate to address those questions directly, but thanks for asking. Our designers, by the way, think a lot about how people meet, what qualities are produced by those meetings, and who should meet whom, and how open is a university campus to external audiences, and so forth. But there is a potential to collaborate on that, and they're pretty open, so let's discuss later and I'll connect you.
I think what I said to Trevor during our coffee break discussion is that there's a counterexample, which is Sharon Trewick's study of Stanford work around the accelerator. And there also all physicists were entering the same courtyard, but even if they were entering the same courtyard, they were escaping each other because they were from competing teams, sitting on the same accelerator. So what Trevick was stressing, what that CERN was different from Stanford in the sense that there they had these French coffee machines, which forced people to talk whether they wanted or not. And even separate coffees were a possibility still. Switzerland had a different cultural behavior. It's not only architecture, but also what you stuff in there and the gadgetry.
Absolutely. So cultural artifacts provide us an interface, a template for our behavior. So we have to design not only the buildings, but the interior to provide for a behavior, but we need to make an informed decision on how people act and how they will react, what people will be there. Do we need to increase their level of trust and openness, or it is high enough, or we need to focus on competitiveness, for instance. And there are, by the way, a number of other instruments which allow us to influence behaviors. For instance, scarcity of resources, as I learned just recently, is a great instrument to bring people together when the money is expensive or time is low. You have to collaborate.
Yeah, I'm a bit worried about this language of influencing behaviors, designing a whole ecosystem of engineering. But there's a great book by Jim Scott at Yale called Seeing Like a State How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. It's a big study of how rational planning can go wrong and produce disaster. And I'm interested in this book because Scott's kind of alternative to this having a big plan and just imposing it on the world. It's something like what I was just talking about, adaptation. The one thing that seems to be missing from your plan is any scheme for changing the plan, right? How do you adapt to what's going to happen there? The other thing that one of Scott's morals that he draws from all these failures is trust people. In your case, how are you going to let the people transform the institution once they're there? Because I think they'll get very fed up if they have to live in an engineered system where their behaviour is already being influenced by well-meaning managers.
I'm getting charmed by engineering systems, and that's why I used the language I did. Just recently I would have used different. I would have used suggest for behaviors or motivate something. And it's not about that rational design. From working with economists for some time, I learned that it doesn't work because the systems are too complex to design them. I've put here on the slide, and I never commented on that communities thingy. And in my paper, which is right in front of me, it's empowering communities. And this is the mechanism for changing a plan, where we'll be giving the communities the opportunity to develop that system themselves.
Who is the we that's doing the giving?
We'll be just suggest. Yes, true. But anyway, we're in a pretty difficult position because we do not control everything, and it doesn't work that way. So we will suggest something, and we will engage people, and by using those instruments, we try to accomplish something I mentioned here. Of course, it's not a direct action.
Well, to answer the question about the we, Артём is the deputy of the deputy. That is the deputy of the foundation. Deputy director is Oleg Alexeyev, and Артём helps him. So the we is pretty collective, and there's also the head of the foundation, which, right?
I think it's a really interesting and tricky problem that you have, and I mean, the most famous example in STS that I can think of is the bridges built by Robert Moses, which are alleged to have certain impacts on behaviour. But it turns out they're extremely contentious, even to the point that Langdon Winner now admits that they did not prevent the buses running down the highways in the way that he imagined. So,
Can you stop for a second? I'll tell the story in Russian. Есть известная статья про то, что мостики на Лонг-Айленде рядом с Нью-Йорком были специально построены в 20-е годы архитектором Нью-Йорка Робертом Мозесом так, чтобы не пропускать автобусы, которые везли черных на пляже. Они пропускали только модель Ford T. И таким образом с помощью не знаю, классовой ненависти или классового господства, соответственно, воплощенным в этих мостиках, архитекторы смогли структурировать пространство вокруг Нью-Йорка. Вот так политика воплощается якобы материальных артефактов. То, что Стив сейчас говорит, что сейчас этот аргумент поставлен под вопрос, и сам автор этой статьи уже говорит, что нет, и автобусы проходили. Но якобы не было никакого структурирования материального пространства с помощью мостиков. Окей, I just recounted the argument.
Thank you very much. I mean, this came to light when a student at Langdon Winner sent me copies of the bus timetable, which documents the buses running along these parkways, blatantly not obstructed by the bridges. But I think there are some other literatures which I'm sure you know about and would be of interest, which are about participatory design, they're about user-centered design. When those literatures do not work, it's because they produce a formula about how users are supposed to behave in response to the designer's wishes. Okay, now list your 4 priorities for using this space. And quite often the users have no idea what are their priorities for using this space. But the better parts of that literature, it seems to me, might be very helpful. The central idea is that you involve potential users in discussions about the design space, so that your idea of involving communities might have a bit more specific purchase, because you talk to people ahead of the design and you involve them in scenario building.
Yeah.
Here my question is, Lena, my question is not only about the design of the university and the Skolkovo Institute of Technology, but the design of the whole city. If what Steve is suggesting that you should talk to potential users, that means talking to 26,000 professionals who will be working there. How do you do it practically? The second thing is that out of this 26, as Oleg was hinting to me at some point, 4,000 will be the biggest Russian bank calculation center of clerks.
Processing.
So they will not, this is the processing center, which will be there as well. There will be kind of, Sekis in addition to the Gaunis of Oxford. So, I mean, who do you take as a priority group? Те, кто обслуживает, с кем надо разговаривать among these people if you build a city. So what's your answer to that?
We'll be conducting all the necessary research and are looking into sociological entities which will help us to determine not only the preferences of the communities, of the people, but also their values in order to connect to that. Mechanisms or theoretical approaches to understanding the mechanisms, how behaviors are formed and how people react to certain objects on the ecosystem. And of course we'll address the questions of engaging people into design of the place. Of course we won't be able to engage 26,000, but key communities could help.
Just want to make a comment, because when you want to make collaboration part of the discourse and what you're trying to build into this social, scientific cultural experiment, if you like, collaboration does not seem to be working very well if it's non-normative concept, in my view. And if there's all sorts of ways of interpreting and interpretations going on, and of course there have been quite a few attempts to bring different disciplines together. For instance, there's been research on nano-ABIC convergence, as an example, and nano-vibe info and Cogno, a European project. And it turns out that when you do interviews, conduct interviews with scientists, for example, the acronym does not hold together very well. So they drop letters. Sometimes it's just nano-bio or bio-info, info-Cogno. And it's not really easy to make this interdisciplinary spaces or programs where it's just a word of...
Please let me give a quick response to that. Of course we understand that even without doing that sociological study, that the audience of Skolkovo is pretty free people and one cannot make them do something. So of course we'll try to create structures which we think will produce the right results, but then we'll change plans dynamically. And currently the plans of the university do not suppose that they will not allow proposals which diverge from a very strict policy of creating those collaborative research centers.
More questions? What we can do, unless you have more things to elaborate now, is that I can present the situation with STS in Russia, and we can see how the two can be juxtaposed, how they hinge on each other. То есть я могу сказать, что происходит с СТС, посмотреть, как это совпадает с интересным Сколково, если совпадает. And the learned audience will tell us where they see some nice French word, rapprochement. И наши ученые коллеги скажут нам, видят ли они здесь точки пересечения. Фрумен видит, я знаю, он рассказал, что социологи должны рассказать, как сделать этот кампус. Но это Фрумен.